In this episode, Christine Sumner, Scientific Officer for the Royal New Zealand Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, otherwise known as SPCA, joins for a discussion on cats, biodiversity and wildlife, human-animal relationships, attitudes, thoughts, and feelings about animals, research, tensions between cost and humane methods, cultural drivers of policy and human behavior change, collaboration and care, animal welfare science, ethics and law, social science, evidence-based advocacy, spay, neuter, and microchipping programs, live animal transport, measuring success, animal rights, improving from within industry, quote-unquote gold standards, benchmarking, continuous improvement, advocating for banning animal racing, and more. I'm excited to introduce Christine Sumner, Scientific Officer for the Royal New Zealand Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, otherwise known as the SPCA. Christine, thank you so much for joining. I'm very excited to hear your ideas, thoughts, and experiences. And to kick things off, tell us a little bit about you and your career journey.
Great, Erin. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate being able to chat and have this conversation. And as you said, discuss my role with SPCA and how I got here. Yeah, I've been with SPCA New Zealand since 2018, September. And on a bit of a adventurous spirit, I applied for a job when I was finishing up my PhD work and saw this advertisement for a job for a charity. And SPCAs are, I think many people know the name when we think of shelters, cats and dogs, but this was for a science officer position. And they were looking for people with the type of background I had. And when you're in grad school, you're always thinking, what am I going to do with all this work I've done with this degree? And I was really excited to see I could work for a charity in the animal welfare space. And so I applied and got the job, and here I am today. And prior to coming here, I finished up my PhD at the University of British Columbia. And I researched dairy farmers' views and dairy veterinarians' views on how to improve dairy calf management on commercial dairy farms in British Columbia and across New Zealand. And I am a qualitative researcher. So I spent time on farms interviewing farmers and also doing focus groups with veterinarians, which are these kind of discussion-based research methods that allow you to get in big, deeper conversations around sensitive topics such as dairy calf welfare on farms. And I loved that work, good 4 years of work. And how I arrived there was prior to that, I had worked internationally with farmers, but much, much smaller farming and around the world. So I worked with an international organization, Heifer International, that provides support to communities that are trying to improve the nutrition in their family, the economic ability, just the ability to make some money. And really, it's just to address hunger and poverty. And so they introduce livestock. So they're typically known for their cows and goats and pigs, but they do a whole range of comprehensive support services because it's usually poverty and hunger are quite complex issues. And I had been doing interviews with these smallholder farmers on their experiences with being part of a project from a big international development organization and just trying to understand their point of view and what were challenges they had, what were things that were going well, and really trying to understand if how that organization's views on animal welfare aligned with what was actually going on the ground on the farms. Prior to that, I had worked many years in captive management with chimpanzees. I had worked in a sanctuary for chimpanzees retired from biomedical research in the United States, and I had also worked for a zoo. So, and prior to that, I had worked in education with farmed animals and children. And so there's a whole range of things that led me to how I got here. But I think this common thread wasn't just studying animals. It wasn't just working with people. It was I found myself very much comfortable and really fascinated with this complex space of human animal relationships and what does welfare mean in that space. And so, yeah, so my current role, I still am doing a lot of that. I do a range of things, but a lot of it is still at this point of how do we as human beings work together to improve animal welfare. And there's lots of different ways that can be accomplished. But I'd say that's probably in a nutshell how I got to where I am today.
Fascinating set of experiences, and you've touched on so many important topics. My interpretation of your comments is part of your work involved in navigating the organizational perspective of what needed to be done, where there were opportunities, where there were challenges, compared to what you were hearing in talking with farmers or other stakeholders through your own research and through direct conversations. What were some of your findings when it came to areas that aligned? And what were some key areas of difference?
I think there is there's different ways we talk about animal welfare, and there's different meanings about what animal welfare is. And I think it's often portrayed that there's animal welfare science, which there is, and animal welfare ethics. But I think there's also, importantly, in animal welfare or animal law, these are kind of these big areas of where we see animals in society, kind of these spaces, like we look at it from these different points of view. But it is always humans and animals have been living together for a long time. And so I think what in our different cultures, what is animal welfare? And also societally, what are these structures around how we organize around animal welfare? What does it mean in a day to day life? And I think they can be very different what animal welfare means depending on who you're asking, what questions you're asking, and who you're talking to. And I think it's so critically important to keep our minds open about that because it can be very different. And I think a good example, and a colleague of mine from UBC did some really nice work on this. Animal welfare science focuses on the animal's experiences. But when you go out and you start talking to people and you start talking, for my example, I was talking to farmers, a colleague of mine was talking to the general public. It means something different to them than what an animal welfare scientist would view it as. A concept of care, how this human element, how that's expressed and what an animal experiences from care. And that is actually really important to a lot of people. And I think that can't be overlooked because animal welfare is a human construct. This is something we've decided exists. And what to do about it is a complex thing. And so I think recognizing and having the humility to see the meaning is different depending on who you're talking to. When you're talking about an institution and it says, here's our animal welfare policies or here's our animal welfare guidelines, that's one version of animal welfare. But that might not be what other people who are maybe on the ground living with animals, for an organization I worked for, raising cattle was part of a big project to improve nutrition, reduce poverty in a community. That those might be completely different perceptions about what animal welfare means to them. So I think trying to figure out that gap, because they don't necessarily translate directly, and what animal welfare means from your daily lived experience could probably, it makes sense that it involves you as the human, your experiences, your relationship. Whereas guidelines might be very specific to the physical health of an animal, the affective state. So are they in pain or distress or experiencing positive things? Are they playing? These are all animal based things. So I think that's probably one thing that I find is where I don't want to say it's universal, but I think it's having the humility to see that there's very different entry points into what animal welfare means.
Thank you so much for sharing that. If I'm hearing you correctly, one interpretation is that we as animal welfare scientists can draw on frameworks, right? We can look at a variety of different lenses including both the animal health side of things, prevention of illness, of injury, etc., as well as the incorporation of positive experiences, whether those are enrichment, play, things of that nature. And there is a layer of knowledge and understanding that those caring for animals each day and engaging with animals each day bring to the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where the social sciences have really added richness to animal welfare science, is that we know that a farmer's relationship with their stock, how they interact with their dairy cows, for example, actually correlates with certain measures of what we would say are animal welfare based, so animal based measures, which seems, I think, from a layperson point of view, might seem commonsensical. If you're gently handling your animals, they're going to be less fearful. And so we do know that there's good research showing this, that the human is actually quite important too. It's an important impact on animal welfare. And I think even the person's attitudes we've seen. So even how the people who are working around animals think and feel. So it's not just their behaviors, it's actually, do they have a positive attitude about the animals they're working with can matter. So I think there is something really important there. And I think that's where the social sciences have helped illuminate that in many ways, and shown that this is definitely, these are important questions to ask and try to understand.
Thank you. One of the many facets to your work as a scientific officer that I find especially compelling and inspiring is that you not only draw on your research experience, you also take that research experience and apply that to areas that involve advocating for change, education, and other ways of supporting positive change moving forward. Can you tell us a little more about your current areas of focus and how you draw on your past experiences to inform those?
Sure. Yeah. So as a science officer, I spend a lot of time working at policy level. So we do a lot of work in advocacy where we advocate for policy change. And this is across a whole range of topics. So where I spend a lot of time is in the cat space in New Zealand. Cats are, I think New Zealand has the highest, if not one of the highest rates of cat ownership in the world. So companion cats are incredibly important members of our families. We also have, anywhere where there's companion cats, there's going to be the unowned cats living in our communities, stray cats. Often people in other countries will refer to them as feral cats, but I think stray is maybe the better word just for this conversation. And then, of course, in New Zealand, we've got feral cats. So these are distinguished as animals living in the wild. So these would be the unsocialized animals that are not living in our communities unowned. And New Zealand being a country with a whole lot of wildlife that is not equipped to deal with introduced mammals such as cats. Cats are carnivores, they're predators on many of the native wildlife here, and they have been implicated in a number of um, reductions or extinctions. It's an incredibly complex topic here because these animals are beloved members of our families, but they're also have a lot of negative impacts on things that are also beloved, such as native wildlife. That space, a lot of that policy work is trying to advocate for things such as people to be what we would consider more responsible. So getting your cat desexed or neutered and spayed. So we really want to prevent unplanned litters of kittens being born each year, because we do have that cycle. It's called kitten season, and we have it every year. And these are just the kittens that it wasn't in the plan that they would born, and it can often lead to big challenges for the kittens themselves. It can lead to more stray cats. A lot of the policy work is trying to get more companion cats neutered or spayed to prevent that. And also microchipped, because microchipping can be a super useful tool with reuniting lost companion cats with their owners. It's crazy, but we do have these cases where a cat goes missing and 3 years later, somebody scoops it up, traps it because they were feeding it, and they scan it, and lo and behold, it has a microchip, and the people had no idea that their cat was still alive. It's To me, it's fascinating how frequently this happens. So microchips help get lost cats with their families. So these are the types of policy things that, as a science officer, I do focus on, and that can be at the national level. In New Zealand, we're organized as a national government, and then we also have these regional governments, and then at a district level. So just when you get more around like cities or large town areas, and they'll have their own local laws. And so trying to just work on that side. And that takes, as a science officer, you want to bring your expertise into the conversations, but you're brokering knowledge because you have to keep up with what's the current research on the benefits of getting your cat spayed and neutered or desexed, and also microchipping. So you do need to have a good handle of the research or evidence that says this is a good thing to do. Because when you're asking for policy change, policy is supposed to address a public problem. So you need to study that public problem. You need to study the problem to see, is this actually something policy is warranted to fix or to address? And then what's the evidence that this is the right policy? And then you're in a position where you spend a lot of time learning, synthesizing all that research and interpreting it. Because when you go in to have meetings and stuff, you don't just start babbling on about stats and studies. You actually have to have these broader conversations around this is understood to the general public or to members of local councils or governments. And so a lot of it is trying to, like I said, you're brokering the knowledge. You're spending time and looking at all the evidence, and you're trying to arrive at a conclusion like this is the right thing to do, and then learning how to communicate that. And so much of that is also building relationships, because it's always the who's delivering the message that matters, right? So spending time showing up to local meetings can be a really important way to build those relationships. And yeah, it's actually, I like being in that space, that human space where you do have to have conversations, and not everyone is wanting to hear what you have to say, but to also have it in constructive ways that you can find common ground, because none of this is both black and white. There's always other things at force. There's economic reasons why a policy might not make sense, or there's a million other things that other policies for other issues. So it's how do we advocate for this particular thing and engage people to care more, I think is one big thing. To work with others, because if you can show that it's not just us saying this, it's many different organizations, many members of the public, that this is actually important to a community or a larger society as a whole. So yeah, I'm in the cat space a lot. I also am in the wildlife space, which kind of makes sense. If you're in the cat space, you are in the wildlife space. And so advocating for the humane treatment of animals that are considered pests. As I said, New Zealand has a lot of introduced mammals, and including rats and Australian possum and mustelids such as stoats and ferrets, weasels, and rabbits, wallabies. There's a whole list of introduced mammals that currently in New Zealand, massive efforts to reduce those numbers of animals to benefit native wildlife. The native wildlife in New Zealand, there's only two native mammals, two types of bats. So mammals in New Zealand actually can have quite a lot of negative impacts on native wildlife. So there's a lot of pest management happening. And so one of my roles is to advocate that however pest management happens, it must be humane and it needs to be effective. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. And oftentimes what's considered as humane, you're talking about on a relative scale, because how pest management happens is always tied to some economic reality. So even you might often in New Zealand, there might be, if you're trying to do large scale pest management of rats in a massive forest block, the methods that are chosen are going to often have to reflect this is what is the most cost effective. And so that might not be the most humane method from our point of view. And just constantly pushing that more humane methods are used and that where they lack, where we don't have good alternatives, is really pushing for more research and development to find these alternatives. So New Zealand actually does a lot of research on finding, they're constantly trying to build a better rat trap, to be honest with you. It's it's an ongoing problem, mostly because obviously these are animals we're talking about and their welfare matters, but that can often get overlooked in the pursuit of other goals such as protecting biodiversity. And so a lot of it is just constantly driving home that these are sentient animals we're talking about and how we go about managing them to protect native animals, to protect biodiversity values. We can't lose sight of it must be humane. So I think those are probably two of the bigger areas as a science officer I'm involved in. And with the pest management, as a science officer, a lot of what we're doing is if there's a proposed, government does a lot of public consultations. So they'll notify the public, we're going to do this type of pest management in this area. A lot of my job is we will make a formal written submission to that public consultation, writing an evidence-based position on why these ways shouldn't be used. So why poisons are not humane. So we have to know the science around why will we say that? Well, we know that poisons can do a whole host of negative things to an animal. This is why you shouldn't use them. And then here's other alternatives that we think are better options. And yeah, so those are probably two of the bigger areas that I work in.
Thank you so much for sharing those examples. And I highlight a couple of things that you mentioned because there are a lot of important takeaways and also share some follow-up questions. The first is, I think, a really powerful example of what you're describing in terms of working with people to make decisions not only for themselves and their pets, but also the broader community includes the kinds of decisions you mentioned with choosing to spay and neuter, choosing to microchip, and other areas where we do have evidence to back up key practices. And as you mentioned, when it comes to developing and advocating for policy, you are taking an approach where you are engaging with and learning from communities and maybe navigating points of disagreement, right? Different considerations depending on different perspectives, whether that is about supporting biodiversity and supporting wildlife, whether that has to do with factors related to human or pet well-being or wellness, and more. Can you talk a bit about when you're advocating for policy or when there's been a policy change, how do you think about success? How are you measuring progress?
Great question. We really try to make sure we acknowledge when we have baby steps success. Sometimes that is the inclusion of the acknowledgement of animal welfare as part of a biodiversity strategy. So oftentimes, like I'll use that as an example. There can be years of a multiple series of public consultations on a biodiversity strategy that the government has. And understandably, it's going to be rooted in conservation sciences. And we're talking about conserving biodiversity, protecting biodiversity. And what can though be overlooked is those are talking about animals on a population level. So we're talking about groups of animals, species. And we consistently advocate that the welfare of those animals also matters. And we see this that has emerged in scientific disciplines of compassionate conservation. We also know that how an individual animal feels, an individual bird, can impact their ability to do bird things like sing their bird songs and attract a bird's mate, and also lead to offspring and rearing chicks and all these things. So an individual welfare can be impacted, which ultimately can impact the species. So we see these as intimately um, linked. One measure of success could be when you, after multiple times of arguing why welfare matters in terms of protecting biodiversity, when you start to just see those words pop up in the strategy, it signals something's happening. It might seem like a very small win, but nonetheless, that kind of measure success. I think it's important to recognize because often in the policy space, it can be years before you see something change. And it often is years. And it's coalition building and it's helping. If this is an important enough issue for your organization, are you doing enough to engage the public? Because a lot of times, to be honest with you, members of the public don't even know about a lot of stuff that's going on at a policy level. And a lot of that can be engaging. So people might not be happy that something's happening, but might not be aware that something's happening or allowed to happen on a policy level. And so that takes time. All of this takes time. And those baby step successes are critically important to keeping you excited about your work and saying, this is making a difference. And then sometimes sharing those baby step successes with others, because they might see it as a success too. It's really important to do that. Other times it's much more grand, I think, or success. Recently in New Zealand, export of livestock was banned. And that had been years. We're talking over a decade of work in this country by multiple different organizations, members of the public, elected officials. So this is years and years of work to get to this point. And of course, that's just along the way, you make small baby steps that are successes. But of course, achieving that policy change to say that this practice is effectively over with and banned, that was a massive win. And so I think it's just success. I think it depends on what you're looking for. Some things feel bigger, but it's also important to find the smaller steps along the way because all those feed into, I think what we're trying to achieve is better relationships with animals in general. And so those small steps help us get there.
Thank you. For those listening that may not be as familiar with what all live export entails, can you walk through what we mean by live transport and why that raises additional animal welfare challenges, why it was such a win to have that banned?
Yeah. So in April of this year, New Zealand was the first country to ban live export of animals out of this country to other countries. And this was by ship. I should clarify, this is by sea. So big boats that are carrying cattle, sheep. And so that was effectively ended. And prior to that, it had been banned. So quite some time ago. So in 2007, it was banned for moving export by sea for slaughter. So prior to 2007, you could put animals on a big boat, ship them to another country for them to be slaughtered in that other country. But what was allowed to still happen is you could live export animals to other countries by sea for breeding. And so you would see examples where in other countries where they want to improve the genetics of their dairy herds. So dairy cattle could be shipped from New Zealand, to be then bred to add those genetics to a herd or help build a new herd in another country. So in 2021 is when the government announced the ban, and then it became effective in 2023 in April. And unfortunately, the current government has signaled they're going to overturn that ban. So you can imagine all of the excitement that we had with that, us and many others. Like I said, this has been in many years, many different organizations, public. That was part of the platform. It was that the current party ran on. And so what we're concerned about is that we're going to go back to this practice that was banned. And the reasons why is you put animals on a boat that's not purposely built for animals. So that's you're already starting off at a deficit. These the animals are then they're crowded onto the boat and then they're shipped to other countries. Knowing where New Zealand is, we're at the bottom of the world. You're crossing the equator. So in a short period of time, these animals go from from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. So that's going to come with it or environmental conditions that, impact how, whether it's really hot. It can impact just being on a boat and just feeling seasickness or dizzy. Also, just being somewhere new, like the novelty of it. And also, these boats aren't designed very well in terms of managing waste. So the pictures are not pretty, that the animals are usually standing in knee deep manure. There's also very limited veterinary oversight because there's a lot of animals on these boats. And so it's just a mess in many ways. In our organization, we all know those things negatively impact the welfare of the animals. For us, it was a big win to say this is no longer acceptable. This shouldn't happen. Like, that's the gist of it. Currently, the argument is that all those things that I just said negatively impact the animals. They can be improved. There could be a gold standard for how we ship them, which is very welfare oriented, right? To say something should end and be banned closes a conversation that how can we improve this? Make these incremental welfare improvements. Our argument is that it's just inherently problematic and that you can't improve it enough to justify doing it. So I think that's in a nutshell. So I guess for your listeners, wait and see. We know the UK just announced a ban. So New Zealand, for as small of a country as we are, like to consider ourselves heavy hitters when it comes to welfare, animal welfare. To think that we're going to go back to what we consider as shameful, it's not a very positive feeling. But there's a lot of people who worked hard for this to be ended. So I think we're just going to continue to fight.
It's encouraging to hear that you're pushing forward and continuing on with the work that you've been doing, and appreciate you sharing that additional detail to help increase understanding of these issues. I wanted to circle back on your reference to gold standard, as you kindly shared what I found to be an incredibly insightful and philosophical way of thinking about animal welfare and why defining anything as a gold standard is perhaps limiting or not the right frame we want to be taking when we think about improving welfare and the lived experience of animals. Can you talk a bit about how you think about that term and how you would define things in an ideal way?
Yeah, it's funny. I think that term is interesting because I think it's one of these words that is used a lot, but the meaning is a little obscured, where it's just vague enough, right? Like we think, I'm talking from personal experience, in my head, it conjures up some excellency, right? Like some point that you've reached. This is the gold standard, which I think it's used in ways, it depends on who's using those terms. I think it's similar to any term that, and a gold standard, I think it's meant to be this thing to which other things are compared. And the idea is that you can reach this point of excellency. And I think there's been good conversations out there past. That term has just been so misused and misconstrued that it's often applied in ways that you're like, I don't think that's what gold standard means, or it doesn't make sense. I should say that it doesn't make sense in these situations, especially when you get to a point where it's just hard to say this can be improved on. And I think it's meant to assure people that things are okay. And I think it happens when you also see things that you might hear that word humane washing, that things get labels attached to them. And the idea that it's almost a way to market something, like it assures you like we're fine. We only ship animals because we have these gold standards of care. But the problem with certain things is what would be a gold standard for managing shipping livestock by sea to other faraway places? Um, and some stuff is just, I think, inherently problematic. And that's how we feel about this is there's things you just can't fix. And it doesn't matter how many standards you have around it. It's not going to resolve the fundamental problems with the practice that negatively impact animal welfare. I think the other bigger issue I have with it is it leads to, I think, what can be a really interesting critique about animal welfare is that it leads to, I think, checking boxes as a measure of welfare, in that you have all these you can tick these boxes and say, we meet all of these standards, therefore our animals are fine, welfare is good. And I think that can be very problematic because from a scientific point of view, we're always striving to improve welfare. We're always learning more. And when you ask one question and answer it, it just creates a whole other mess of questions that you're like, oh, we need to learn more about that now. And so the more you learn, the more it drives you to learn more. So there's not this point at which ticking boxes makes sense from that point of view. We should constantly be striving to do better. And I think what can happen when we portray something as a gold standard is it somehow stops that. There's an inertia that can get in there to say we don't have to improve because we're already hitting this gold standard. And the gold standard can only reflect what we currently know. So from a scientific point of view, if 10 years down the line we've learned more, then that gold standard can become dated. And so that's another issue with this concept. Yeah. I think those are the two big things that bother me with it.
So if we draw on the business or strategy frameworks, approaching it with a continuous approach in
Yeah.
mind, essentially building in those inflection points to understand where are we making progress and what does progress look like now that we know more.
Yeah. I think what, you think about benchmarking, a lot of commonly used business tool to drive improvements. And the idea, it's a process. Like you're constantly measuring against your competitors to see, who's doing the best. And it's a different idea. Like that is continuous improvement. And I think that's a different way of looking at things. Like you don't get stuck into saying we took these boxes off this set of standards, so we're okay. It's what if your neighbor is doing better than you? Don't you want to know that? Wouldn't you want to know, like, how can I improve welfare more? So, yeah. So I think it's like there are business tools out there that have been adopted by animal welfare researchers and farmers, and are exploring to see, can this be one way to drive improvements? And it can. And it really can depend on like any benchmark, it matters what you're looking at. And it matters how do the people involved in that benchmark think about the benchmark, right? Is it achievable for them? Is it something worthwhile for them to be involved in? So there are business tools that can really matter. But I think in terms of a gold standard, it can fall victim to being a humane washing and also stifling improvements in welfare.
Absolutely. I want to connect the dots between what you were just walking through and your previous comment when we looked at the example with animal transport. And what I hear from your remarks is there's an imperative to approach animal welfare from a continuous improvement perspective. And there are certain cases, certain situations, certain practices that, number one, may be so problematic that there isn't an animal welfare framework to achieve a certain standard, to achieve good welfare for an animal. And based on some comments you've shared previously, that there may be cases where animal welfare in and of itself may be one lens, but we need to bring other lenses to the conversation as well. How do you think about widening that lens when we think about the animal's lived experience and navigating what progress looks like for any given situation.
I think it's really important to widen the lens. I think it's not fixed. Our relationships with animals are not fixed in time. I think they reflect our thinking in our daily lives, our experiences with animals, and that change has changed. It's always changing, and there gets to a point where how we think about things that might have been acceptable are no longer acceptable. And I think a lot of that can be driven. It just depends on where that's being driven from an animal welfare science point of view. The more we understand, for example, that a common practice on dairy farms, such as disbudding or the little horn buds on a young dairy calf so that they don't end up growing horns as they get older, that's done in fairly invasive ways. And the welfare science, a lot has shown that this is quite painful experience for calves, and that the use of pain mitigation, so during and after, can really help lessen the impact that those calves experience, the negative impact. So you get to a point where the science side is indicating it is painful and pain medications can help relieve some of that pain. So you get to a point where you start saying it's not acceptable to do this without any pain relief. So I think that's one way. Other ways that we see what's driving the change it can be more different cultural aspects, such as companion animals. Like I saw a joke on the internet the other day. A guy was talking to his dog and he was videotaping his dog sleeping down on the couch. He was saying, did you know 100 years ago, dogs were kept outside? And he's saying this about his dog, and his dog is just looking at him upside down on the couch. And I think it's funny because it reflects like our relationships, our cultural ideas of what a companion dog is has changed. And so I think that can be driven from, that's not necessarily animal welfare science driving that. That is different processes. In New Zealand, we've got the Animal Welfare Act. So that's a big societal thing. Your legal system and all that unfolds from that will drive what's acceptable and what's not acceptable practices. So that was driven by changing ideas about our relationships with animals, but then the act itself then becomes its own thing and starts driving changes within society. Like in this country, in New Zealand, you can't dock a dog's tail. So this would be for cosmetic reasons. Of course, a veterinarian, if there's something therapeutic, like an amputation, you can do that. But I moved here with my little dog who had, full disclosure, I didn't dock his tail, but he had it docked by the time I adopted him. But that, you wouldn't get away with that here in New Zealand. Like that, because under the law, you can't do that. So you can see where, and I've had little kids come up to me and they're like, oh, little dog, where's his tail? Because you can see where that's changed views in society. This is no longer acceptable. Therefore, even this expectation that dogs have their tails has changed, that they all should have their tail. So yeah, I think to your question specifically, I can think from our point of view, a recent change in our view on something is in the past, we have held strong animal welfare views on greyhound racing in New Zealand. And in fact, we, SPCA, had members sitting on the animal welfare committee for the industry. But over time, we found that the industry itself has not been amenable to improvements in animal welfare. And now it's to a point where even though there is problems with the industry, this idea about engaging and improving from within is an important part of how we work with organizations. But it got to the point where that spirit of improving welfare from within meaningfully was no longer there. We changed our position and now we strongly advocate for banning the industry. At this point, you get to the point, and that's based on the values of our organization. So yes, you can still make animal welfare improvements within the industry, but from our point, now we're talking about our values. So this is not a question of science anymore. It's gotten to a point where we no longer see this as something meaningfully happening. So we think the industry should just not exist. And you can get to that change, right? To that point where you have to make a decision at some point. And That's where your organization's values can help. Where is that compass point? At what point do you change? And whereas we're well aware that there's animal rights organizations in New Zealand who have long advocated for a ban on greyhound racing because it's just fundamentally it's objectifying the animals, or it's using animals in a way that it's using animals, so it's not okay. And that's not even to do with the harms that the animals experience, injuries, and maybe not poor rearing conditions, just a whole range of things. So in many ways, we want a ban on greyhound racing industry. We just got there for a different reason than other organizations, but that's where you'll see a coalition of different organizations joining together because we arrive at that line, and yeah. So I think that's where you can show strength and you can show a diversity of views, and I think it can be quite pragmatic if you know that if you're both looking for the same outcome, or if there's many of you that you just get there a different way, but if it's the same outcome you're looking for, it can be very powerful to work together.
Absolutely. That's inspiring to hear about how you and your organization are coming together with other organizations and helping to inform and educate and collaborate from a variety of different perspectives and lenses, including some of what you'd already mentioned for any of these circumstances when it comes to pain and other key indicators from animal welfare science, and also bringing in animal rights and other perspectives, including and not limited to what the animals actually experience and what they're being used for.
Yeah.
You have talked about your career experiences. You highlighted a variety of different ways that you are creating positive impact in your current role and have supported animals and animal welfare from some different areas of focus, from some different types of work. What advice would you share with those who are aspiring to work in roles and careers that support animals in some way, that are contributing to or aligned with animal welfare in some way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say find as many different collaborators and partners and colleagues to work with, build your network of people. It can be a small world, and that there is a lot of appetite for people working together. I think animal welfare folks, so if you go via the academic animal welfare science route, you want to see change. It's not basic research, it is applied research. You want to see your work get used. You want to see improvements in animals' lives. And working with others who might be in that space, such as an advocacy organization, even can be super beneficial. Organizations such as mine, we have a science team. We all have academic backgrounds and research backgrounds, and we work as advocates. And so that background is always useful for an organization, especially if your organization values or an organization values taking an evidence-based approach to advocacy. Getting involved in policy work is actually, I think, it's different. You have to learn how to write differently and interact differently, but that research background is very helpful. So I think if you expand that network, if you're an animal welfare scientist, find social scientists to work with. Just go for it and reach out to people. And I've done that with my own colleagues, and it can be very satisfying. And that work is really important. And I would also say when Erin, you and I met at a conference that was like very diverse. You've got organizations for human behavior change, which is a certain view on how to look at animal issues. But you just get this whole range of different organizations and researchers trying to improve the lives of animals and our relationships with them. That's what I would say is be broad and develop that network, and don't be shy. Just reach out.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation, and I'm so grateful for you taking the time and sharing your thoughts and perspectives. For those that want to learn more, where can they check out more about your work, these issues, how to get involved in animal welfare, and more?
So we are fortunate to have on our main page, so SPCA is or if you Googled SPCA New Zealand, we do have an advocacy page off of our main page. So if you were to go to our main website, there is a drop down menu for how you can help. And one of our options is advocate for animals. And that is the home for a lot of the work the science team does. It's not all of it, but it's some of our big key issues right now that we're highlighting. And that really gives a good thorough background on these issues that are not, they're complex and they're usually policy related. And so that's a great place to start, I would say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you're doing for animals, people, and the environment.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks so much for joining this episode of the Compassionate and Beneficial Living podcast. Please follow, subscribe, share your comments, share with others, and let us know what topics you'd like to hear covered next.